Hey y'all, what is up? Keasbey here. So today we're going to be doing another video for the newer and learning players out there, but I think we can all sometimes use a reminder on these. And it's going to be 5 easy to avoid mistakes to, well, avoid. But before we get into all that, don't forget to drop this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and if you want to help support us just a bit more, check out the link in the description to grab yourself a playmat. So, not a lot of preamble for this, but we are going to run through 5 mistakes that I've seen players make, myself included, so that you don't make them yourself. So starting right off with number 1 is surrendering at a bad time. So granted, I know sometimes you're playing online and you just don't have the patience to go through a match you might not win, or you're just looking for quick testing. I want to do a video about online etiquette eventually, but please, if you are testing, mention it in your room notes. I'm talking about in an actual competitive sense. Sometimes game 1, your opponent sets up and you can look at your hand and know, okay, there's no way out of this. So you have 2 choices there. Play and hope that your opponent misplays, or force them into a game 2 completely blind. Look, it just falls that way sometimes. You draw a suboptimal hand or your opponent sets up in a way you weren't ready for. Anything really. But there's no reason to give your opponent more information than you need to. Especially if you lost the die roll. They don't know if you plan to go first or second now. They don't know if they need to be worried about back row. It's just a complete shot in the dark while you are now working off of full knowledge. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying toss game 1 to get a free game 2, because it's a risk. You're putting your opponent a full game ahead of you. What I am saying is, in a no-win situation, sometimes it's better to jump into game 2 with the knowledge advantage than to bank on your opponent making a mistake that there's really no guarantee that they'll make. But let's talk the flip side of that. Again, there's plenty of other factors that could go into this, but I've also seen games where an opponent has surrendered and the next card off the top gave them a solid chance to win, and if they just waited to see it, they'd potentially be going into game 2 with the first round instead of having to play from behind. All in all, don't give up early. And we're not talking about time rules here because that's a whole other can of worms I don't want to get into in this video. But don't fight a losing fight for the sake of fighting. Sometimes the knowledge advantage can be better to force that game 3. So next, speaking of knowledge, let's talk about firing off effects too soon without knowing what to be on the lookout for. I see this a lot with cards like Terraforming. I'll fire it off at the start of a turn and it eats an Ash Blossom. An Ash Blossom that would have been better saved for an Eaglin down the line that I no longer have a chain block for. Or you'll see someone use their Ash on Despian Tragedy, only to get hit with a Branded Fusion next move. This is starting to get gameplay specific, so I'll back it up and say, don't fire off all your interactions the first chance you get. Yes, sometimes the correct move is to hit the Terraforming with Ash because you know there's a mine coming if you don't. Or maybe you have hand knowledge and know that the Stratos resolving will make or break the game for your opponent. Part of this does come down to knowledge of matchups, which is very important, but part of it also comes down to patience and paying attention. Don't fire off everything you have card for card with your opponent. Sometimes you have to let them get a few extra cards in hand to prevent them from ultimately building their board. Especially in games 2 and 3, once you've seen what they're playing, you can readjust what you want to counter and what you want to let resolve and not just trade card for card every single play. Always make your choices based off of the current game state and everything that you know. Speaking of, remember your opponent's searches. Okay, this one, if you remember nothing else, is probably the biggest one to remember, and it's only falling in the middle of the list for content flow reasons. I've won games because my opponent wasn't paying attention when I added DD Crow. Or my absolute favorite, my opponent destroyed a set Featherstorm, triggering it to let me search out Feather Duster, proceeded to set 4 back row, none of which were able to stop Duster, then indignantly called me lucky for drawing the 1 of Duster. Like, my friend, y'all saw me search it, and then you proceeded to set 4 anyway. This majorly ties into the above point about timing your interactions. Let's say you're slugging it out and you've seen 3/4 of your opponent's hand. You can make plays based around this knowledge, and you can choose to let things resolve or counter them because you can start to make predictions about their potential lines. I can't stress enough how important it is to keep track of everything your opponent adds to their hand because it creates so much less guesswork for you. In my most recent matchup video, I make a ton of gameplay choices because I know my opponent had Engage and Hornet drones in hand, and because I knew Engage, I knew that I had to play around a potential Widow Anchor, which then proceeded to influence my plays based on, do I think they have Ash, do I think they have Effect Veil, or so on and so forth. Basically, if I didn't account for what I knew my opponent had in their hand, or had I just not remembered or not been paying attention, I most likely would have lost that game. Flowing quite naturally from that, mistake number 4 is not paying attention to the board state, but more specifically the graveyard and banish piles. Again, I've seen games won and lost because a player didn't check for a graveyard effect on both ends. Just like paying attention to your opponent's hand, know what they have tucked away in their grave and banished. I mention banished a lot specifically because I'm a Flandreese player, and against the Flandreese player, the banish pile is basically a second hand, so be prepared for us to grab anything from there with a good old Tugan. But in all seriousness, it's easy to get so zeroed in on what's happening in the field and the hands that you can maybe not be paying quite enough attention to the spent pile of cards that is the graveyard, because in a lot of cases, it's not exactly that spent. If nothing else as well, knowing that nothing can be done from a graveyard can give you peace of mind as well to play deeper into your combos and more securely use your interactions against on-field and hand resources. And lastly, read anything you aren't sure of and pay attention to restrictions. So this isn't my saying players are going to cheat. It can happen, but I want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt. But people do make honest mistakes, and if you don't catch them in time, you can lose games. Let's say your opponent uses Pot of Prosperity and you hit it with Ash. They then proceed to, down the line during the turn, use an effect to draw a card. Well, thankfully you read Pot of Prosperity and know that they actually can't draw by card effects for the rest of the turn that they activated that card. Or let's go with a slightly more layered example of a game against Sword Soul. Once they use a Shunna, they can't make Barone down the line. It's partly on your opponent to know this, but it's also on you to be aware that a Shunna restricts them from special summoning any non-worm monster. Take the chance of playing online or with your friends to really read every card and learn not just what they do, but pay attention to what they stop your opponent from doing. Because sometimes it isn't always as obvious as Pot of Prosperity, and the restriction was layered in 4 or 5 moves ago on a seemingly innocuous move. And if you are in a competitive environment, don't feel bad about calling over a judge if your opponent is attempting to do something that you know their previous play restricts them from doing. And again, always read anything you aren't sure about. Okay, I lied, I have one more, and this one is quick. And it's the difference between activate and use, and the difference between negating an effect and negating an activation. So quickly to start, if a card negates the effect of another card, like Ash Blossom for example, who does not negate activations, this is important to know for effects like Magical Meltdown, which only protect from effects that negate activations specifically. If you use Ash Blossom on a card, that card is still considered to have been activated. So in this case, if a card reads, you can only activate this effect once per turn, well, you're out of luck. You may not have gotten the effect, but that was still your one activation. Now, if a card reads, negate the activation, like Solemn Strike or Ghost Bell for example, then you can use a second copy of that card or effect, again provided it specifically says you can only activate one per turn. Now, for anything that says use instead of activate, no matter if the activation or just the effect is negated, that's it. You can't use a second copy or attempt to activate it again, as the wording of use basically means you can only make one attempt at using the effect or card that turn. Also, keep that in mind for cards with restrictions as well, as if the restriction is tied to the activation, the use, or is part of the effect, it acts differently. Okay, that was the quick bonus one that I wanted to mention. Anyway, I hope these will help some of you out. If you already know about all of this, awesome, glad to hear it, keep on keeping on. But if any of y'all learned anything or found this helpful, don't forget to drop this video a like, check out the link in the description to help us out by grabbing a playmat, and subscribe to the channel for even more. And I'll catch y'all later.